The honourable member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. 235,000 Canadians experienced homelessness each and every year. In Saskatoon, a point-in-time count found that 475 individuals, including 26 young people and 11 children, experienced homelessness one night in April 2018. In Toronto, 6,800 people experienced homelessness last night, including 523 young people and 802 women. But these, of course, are not numbers, Madam Speaker, they are people. We know that the face of homelessness is changing. The fastest growing population accessing homeless shelters in Canada are families with young children. Women and children fleeing violence use shelters. And young people who identify as LGBTQ2S are overrepresented among those who are homeless, as are youth who have aged out of foster care, and as are Indigenous peoples in urban centres. For these reasons and others, New Democrats believe that all Canadians have a right to safe, affordable housing. So why does it matter if Canadians have a right to safe and affordable housing enshrined in our laws? Tim Richter, the CEO of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, I think said it best in a public comment he made last year, and I quote, "We know that rights-based housing approaches are the most effective approach to resolving homelessness and housing need. Without these rights-based approaches, I think the National Housing Strategy will not be as effective as it could be and may not meet its objectives." In other words, we need a rights-based housing policy because it is the most effective approach to solving homelessness, and without taking this approach, the government's housing policies and programs are likely to fail. Why has this Liberal government failed to enshrine the right to housing into law, something we had expected from this government? The obvious reason is that perhaps they don't believe that safe and affordable housing is a right. And if they don't believe that, then as a government, you are under no obligation to uphold or protect that right. And that's exactly what this government is doing. They are refusing to change our laws to ensure housing is a right, and they are choosing, I believe, to tolerate homelessness in Canada today, tomorrow, and in the future. The stated goal of this government's own plan to address homelessness is to reduce by 50% the number of chronic users of homeless shelters in 10 years. How can we end homelessness if ending homelessness is actually not the goal of the government? So if we fast forward a decade and assume that this government's homelessness policy is 100% successful in achieving its goal, what would we expect on April 4th, 2029? Well, we would see 3,400 residents still staying in homeless shelters in Toronto. 169 people would be homeless in Hamilton. 700 would be homeless in Ottawa. Over 1,000 people would be homeless in Vancouver. And in my community in Saskatoon, there would be 288 people homeless, including 13 young people and 6 children. And that's if the current plan works. Madam Speaker, I find this unacceptable. And so my original question still stands. Why won't this government enshrine the right to safe, affordable housing in legislation? And why won't this government commit to ending homelessness once and for all? Thank you.
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Tourism, Official Languages and La Francophonie.
Madam Speaker, the member from Saskatoon West points out some of the housing challenges that Canada faces. These challenges are well known to our government, which is why from day one of our mandate, we've made it a top priority to ensure that more Canadians have a safe, affordable place to call home. We began funding solutions to these problems from our very first budget in 2016. Madam Speaker, Canadians don't have to wait for results. We've invested $5.7 billion to date and have improved housing for close to 1 million families. This includes young families, seniors, women, and children fleeing domestic violence, Indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, persons with mental health and addiction issues, veterans, and young adults. And at the same time as we were responding to immediate housing needs, we've begun delivering a comprehensive long-term plan, Canada's first ever national housing strategy. Many of the main initiatives of this 10-year, $40 billion plan were rolled out last spring. New homes and shelters are already being built. Existing homes are being repaired and renovated. We've launched an updated and expanded homelessness strategy with dedicated funding for Indigenous homelessness and more flexibility for communities to develop solutions that meet their needs. We're also investing in better data to get a clear picture of the issues across Canada to develop innovative solutions. We're working in close collaboration with the provinces and the territories with 7 bilateral agreements in place and others well underway. These agreements are unlocking further investments for housing, like direct benefits for low-income Canadians and funding to stabilize community housing. Finally, I want to take a moment to specifically address my colleagues' comments regarding Indigenous housing. In February, we announced $638 million in investments to ensure Indigenous peoples living in urban, rural, and northern communities have better housing outcomes now and for generations to come. 1/3 of this funding will be delivered through the Canada Community Housing Initiative as part of the bilateral agreements. It will help preserve and improve the condition of community housing units for urban Indigenous families living in cities or urban centres across the country. 2/3 of the funding will address Indigenous homelessness. This represents an increase of almost 70% in dedicated Indigenous funding for homelessness. The funds delivered through Canada's new homelessness strategy, Reaching Home, which I mentioned earlier. As part of this funding, will also flow through the National Housing Co-Investment Fund, which will lead to more Indigenous housing projects, new and renovations, whether projects to create new homes or repair or modernize existing ones. Finally, we're also working closely with our Indigenous partners to finalize distinction-based housing strategies. These First Nations, Inuit, and Métis strategies will address the unique needs of the communities, and they are backed by a significant investment of $1.5 billion. Madam Speaker, I'm extremely proud of the work that we've achieved, but we know that there is much more work to be done. And to keep that momentum strong, we need to keep housing on the agenda for the long term. That's why we will soon be tabling legislation to protect the National Housing Strategy. The legislation will include measures to ensure accountability and to ensure that those most affected by Canada's housing challenges continue to have a strong voice in solutions going forward. It has strong support from Canadians across the country. Madam Speaker, I hope we can also count on the support of members from both sides of this House for the legislation. We have an opportunity to make a lasting change for housing in Canada, change that will create a strong economy, strong communities, where everyone in Canada has a safe and affordable place to call home.
Honourable Member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to make some comments and take some issue with the government's response and their boasts about the infamous $40 billion number and dollars we keep hearing about. And I think it's important for Canadians to recognize that much of this money was promised under the previous federal government, and this government is taking a great deal of credit where it is not owed. We've had lots of announcements, very little investment. And especially since of the $40 billion, that includes matching funding not only from provinces and territories and municipalities, but also from private partners. It is not $40 billion invested by the federal government. As usual, Liberal words do not match actions. When it comes to homelessness, though, I think we can do better. Enshrining, I do hope that the legislation that the Parliamentary Secretary spoke about does enshrine the right to housing in law and commits the resources as well, and develops policies in support of this goal and measures their effectiveness as well. New Democrats know this, Madam Speaker, and we're ready to do just that. Thank you.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, the bottom line is that everyone in Canada deserves a place to call home and that they can afford and that meets their needs. Our government has made this a top priority since the beginning of our mandate, and we are already seeing the results. Already close to 1 million people in Canada have benefited from our investments in housing, and momentum is strong to reach our ambitious goal of lifting 530,000 Canadians out of housing need to reduce chronic homelessness by 50%. The National Housing Strategy's main programs have been rolled out. New projects are already breaking ground. We are working to finalize new First Nations, Inuit, and Métis strategies. New, more progressive bilateral agreements are being signed. And we're close to launching legislation to keep the housing on the agenda for generations to come. Yes, housing needs continue to be great, and yes, there's still lots of work to do, but Canadians are already feeling some relief. We're on track to make a lasting difference, giving more people a safe and affordable place to call home.